Jonathan Blake was a man who valued silence. At 42, he lived alone in a small, craftsman-style house on the outskirts of Port Angeles, a quiet town nestled in the rain shadow of the Olympic Mountains. His days were a study in routine: wake at 6, brew a single cup of black coffee, and sit by the bay window to watch the mist rise off the Strait of Juan de Fuca. As an architect who worked remotely for a firm in Seattle, his life was dictated by blueprints and deadlines, not by human interaction. He liked it that way. His only regular contact was with Carol, the elderly widow next door, and the barista at the local bookstore cafe who knew his order by heart. This carefully constructed piece was his sanctuary, a fortress built from habit and solitude. He believed he was untouchable in his anonymity. His finances were automated, his mail was mostly bills and architecture journals, and his social life consisted of brief, polite nods to neighbors. There was a comfort in the predictability, a safety in being invisible. He often thought about how a life without dramatic highs also meant a life without devastating lows. It was a philosophy that had served him well since his divorce 5 years prior. He had healed by shrinking his world to a manageable size. But fortresses, he was about to learn, are only as strong as their weakest gate, and he had never considered that the threat wouldn't come knocking on his front door, but would simply slip inside and pretend to be him. The first crack in his world appeared on a Tuesday. It arrived not with a bang, but with a faint buzz from his laptop. An email from his bank, subject line, security alert, unusual activity detected. His heart, unused to sudden jolts, performed a strange, skipping beat. He clicked it open, his eyes scanning the sterile, blocky text. It mentioned a large withdrawal from an ATM in Spokane, a city on the other side of the state, a place he had never visited. His first thought was a glitch. His second, a mild annoyance at the inconvenience of having to call and correct a computer error. The call to the bank's customer service line did not bring relief. It brought confusion, then a cold, creeping dread. The representative, a woman with a syrupy southern accent named Brenda, confirmed the withdrawal in Spokane. Jonathan, still convinced it was a mistake, explained he was in Port Angeles. "Of course, sir," Brenda said cheerfully. "We'll flag that card and send you a new one. Now, to verify, can you confirm the last 4 of your social?" He did. There was a pause, a click of keys. "Okay, Mr. Blake. And while I have you here, I see you recently updated your contact information with us. Just to confirm, your new address is 1420 Beechwood Lane in Spokane?" The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Jonathan's mouth went dry. "No," he said, his voice suddenly thick. "My address is 318 Cedar Street, Port Angeles. I never changed my address." Another pause, longer this time. Brenda's cheerful tone was replaced by a cautious, professional hum. "I'm showing a change was made online last week, sir. Along with a request for a new debit card to be sent to that address. Mr. Blake, has your phone or laptop been acting strangely lately? Have you clicked on any suspicious links?" Jonathan's mind was racing, trying to process the information. Identity theft. It was a concept he read about in news articles, a misfortune that befell careless people. It wasn't something that happened to a recluse who lived by the bay window. Brenda walked him through the next steps, freezing the accounts, filing a police report, contacting the credit bureaus. He wrote everything down on a scrap of paper, his architect's hand, usually so precise, now shaky and illegible. As he hung up, a new email arrived. It was a receipt for a new credit card, one he hadn't applied for, with a credit limit that made his stomach lurch. The imposter wasn't just stealing what he he was building a new life on the foundation of Jonathan's name. The following days were a blur of phone calls, online forums, and a deep, unsettling paranoia. Jonathan spent hours on hold, repeating the same story to bank managers, credit card company representatives, and finally, a disinterested officer at the local police precinct. The officer, a young man named Deputy Miller, took his report with a sigh, explaining that these cases were often difficult to trace. They're usually run by outfits overseas, Mr. Blake, Miller said, tapping his pen on the notepad. By the time we track the IP, it's a dead end. The best we can do is give you this report number so you can start cleaning up your credit. But Jonathan couldn't let it go. He was an architect, a man who solved problems by understanding their structure. This problem had a structure too, and he was determined to find its weak point. He requested his full credit report and pored over every line. There were accounts he didn't recognize, inquiries from lenders he'd never heard of, and there, buried in the fine print, was the address on Beechwood Lane. 1420 Beechwood Lane, Spokane. The imposter had a physical location. He wasn't some ghost in a server farm, he was a person receiving mail, and perhaps, living at a real place. A dangerous thought began to form in Jonathan's mind. A thought that went against every instinct of his quiet, cautious nature. The police weren't going to help. The banks were too slow. The only person who could solve this was him. He looked at the address on his screen, then out his bay window at the familiar, safe street. The fortress felt breached. The only way to feel safe again, he reasoned, was to go to the source of the breach. He opened a new browser tab and started looking for bus tickets to Spokane. It was a 7-hour journey across the state, a trip into the unknown, and the first active choice he had made in years that wasn't on a blueprint. The Greyhound bus dropped Jonathan off in Spokane late on a Thursday afternoon. The city felt alien, harsh and concrete compared to the damp, green quiet of Port Angeles. He checked into a cheap motel near the station, the kind with flickering neon and a persistent smell of stale cigarette smoke. That evening, he took a rideshare to Beechwood Lane. It was a street of modest, post-war houses, with chain-link fences and cars parked on front lawns. Number 1420 was a small, one-story bungalow with peeling paint on the window frames. A single light was on behind a curtained window. Jonathan sat in the back of the car, heart pounding, as the driver asked if this was the place. He just nodded, paid, and got out. He stood across the street, hidden in the shadow of a large maple tree. He had no plan. Confrontation? Call the police and point? He felt utterly ridiculous, an architect playing detective. He watched the house for an hour. A man he couldn't quite see moved behind the curtain. Then, a figure emerged, walking to a beat-up sedan parked in the driveway. In the dim light of the street lamp, Jonathan got his first clear look at the man who had stolen his life. He was about the same age as Jonathan, with a similar build. He wore jeans and a plain gray hoodie. As he got into the car and drove away, Jonathan caught a glimpse of his face. It was a shock. The man was handsome in a rugged, unremarkable way. But it was his expression that froze Jonathan. He didn't look like a master criminal. He looked tired. He looked scared. This was not what Jonathan had expected. He had pictured a slick con artist, a predator. Instead, he saw a man who moved with the weary caution of prey. Confused and more determined than ever, Jonathan decided to wait. He found a spot deeper in the shadows and settled in, his curiosity now warring with his anger. The mystery of the man's fear was a new, compelling element in the blueprint of his stolen life. It was almost midnight when the sedan returned. Jonathan watched the man get out, but this time, he wasn't alone. The dome light of the car revealed a second figure in the passenger seat, a larger man with a shaved head. They were arguing. The man from the house, the imposter, got out and slammed the door, walking quickly towards his front door. The larger man got out too, slower, more deliberate. He pointed a thick finger at the imposter and said something sharp and final before getting back in his car and driving off. The imposter stood on his porch, his shoulders heaving as if catching his breath after a sprint. He fumbled with his keys, dropped them, and looked over his shoulder into the dark street. He looked directly at the maple tree where Jonathan was hiding. Jonathan pressed himself against the trunk, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. But the man didn't see him. He just scanned the darkness with the wide, searching eyes of a hunted animal, then disappeared inside. Jonathan stood frozen for a long time. The anger that had fueled his journey was now mixed with a potent dose of fear. Who was that larger man? What kind of trouble was this imposter in? This was no longer just about credit card fraud. This felt darker, more dangerous. He should go back to his motel, call the police, and give them the address. Let them handle it. That was the smart, safe thing to do. But as he turned to leave, a thought stopped him. The police might come, but they would be walking into a situation they didn't understand. And the man who stole his identity, the one with the scared eyes, might not be the only villain in this story. The next morning, Jonathan made a decision. He would confront the imposter. Not with anger, but with the evidence. He would show him the police report, the frozen accounts, and demand to know why. He wanted to see the face of the man who had taken his name and see if there was any remorse there. He printed copies of all the documents at the motel's business center and walked back to Beechwood Lane. It was a gray, overcast morning. He knocked on the door of 1420. No answer. He knocked again, harder. The door creaked open a few inches. It wasn't locked. He pushed it open slowly. "Hello," he called out. The house was silent and smelled of stale coffee and old paper. The living room was sparse, a second-hand sofa, a folding table with a laptop, and stacks of mail. His mail. He saw envelopes from his bank, from credit card companies, all addressed to him at this address. A wave of violation washed over him, hotter and more intense than before. This wasn't just a crime, it was a desecration. He walked further in, his anger mounting. He called out again, but the house remained silent. He heard a faint sound from the back of the house, a shuffle. He followed it down a narrow hallway to a small bedroom. The door was ajar. He pushed it open. The imposter was there, half hidden behind the door, his eyes wide with the same fear Jonathan had seen the night before. He was holding a small kitchen knife in front of him, his hand shaking. The two men stood frozen, facing each other in the cramped, dim space. The air was thick with tension, neither one speaking, neither one moving. The only sound was the distant hum of a refrigerator and the frantic beating of two very different, but equally terrified, hearts. The silence was broken by the imposter. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "You need to leave. Right now." He lowered the knife slightly, but his eyes kept darting to the window, as if expecting someone else to appear. Jonathan stood his ground, his own fear eclipsed by a surge of righteous fury. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice low and trembling. "You stole my life. My name. My money. I want to know why." The imposter, whose name was David Mercer, let out a short, bitter laugh. Your life? You think I wanted your life? I needed any life. A quiet one. I saw your name, your boring, perfect credit score, your little house by the water, and I thought, that's a hole no one will ever look for me in. His confession was delivered not with arrogance, but with a desperate, exhausting honesty. Jonathan was stunned into silence. What are you talking about? Who's looking for you? He asked. David's face crumpled. People who will kill me. I made the mistake of working for them. I was a bookkeeper. I found things I wasn't supposed to find. I saw them do something terrible to a man who wanted to leave. I ran. I ran with nothing, and I had to become nothing, or someone else. He gestured to the room around them. I picked you because you were nothing. No wife, no kids, no chaos. Just quiet. I was going to use it to hide, build a little cash, and move on. You would have never known. The credit cards, the bank stuff. I got greedy. I'm sorry. Jonathan's mind struggled to process the information. The man he had hated, the phantom who had dismantled his peace, was standing before him not as a monster, but as a terrified victim. A bookkeeper on the run from killers. It sounded like a movie plot. But the fear in David's eyes was not an act. It was raw, primal, and utterly convincing. Then go to the police, Jonathan said, his voice softer now. Tell them what you saw. They can protect you. David shook his head violently. No. These people, they have money, they have reach. Witness protection takes time, and I don't have time. The man you saw last night, his name is Merrick. He's the one who did it. He gave me 24 hours to come back with what I took. I didn't take anything. I just ran. But they think I have proof. I don't. I just have my eyes. And now he's going to come back, and he's not going to believe me. A heavy silence fell between them. Two men, connected by a crime, now united by a greater threat. Jonathan looked at the knife still dangling loosely in David's hand. He looked at the stacks of mail, the stolen identity that now felt like a life raft for a drowning man. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, hard dread. The enemy was no longer the man in front of him. The enemy was the man in the sedan, the one with the shaved head and the pointing finger. The enemy was coming. And Jonathan Blake, the architect who valued silence, was now standing in the crossfire of someone else's war. The question of what to do next was answered for them. A sound from the front of the house made them both freeze. The creak of a floorboard. Then another. Footsteps. Someone had entered the house without knocking. David's face went white. He put a finger to his lips and pointed frantically under the bed. Jonathan, his heart seizing in his chest, didn't think. He just moved, dropping to the floor and sliding into the dusty darkness beneath the box spring. Through a gap in the bed skirt, he could see David's legs. He saw him grip the knife again, his knuckles white. Heavy footsteps approached the bedroom door. A man's voice, thick with a guttural accent, filled the silence. David. Time's up. We need to talk. David didn't move. There's nothing to talk about, Merrick. I told you, I don't have anything. Merrick stepped into the room. From his low angle, Jonathan could see his heavy boots, the hem of a long dark coat. I don't believe you, Merrick said, his voice calm and terrifying. "You were always too smart, David. You kept records of everything. Where are they?" He took a step closer to David. "Last chance. Give me the files, and maybe you get to keep using that nice, boring name you found for yourself." David stammered, "I swear, Merrick, I deleted everything. I just ran. I didn't want any part of it." Merrick sighed, a sound of profound, theatrical disappointment. "I'm going to ask you one more time, and then I'm going to have to search for myself." Merrick moved then, not towards David, but towards the small desk in the corner of the room. He began rifling through papers, tossing them aside with contempt. David remained frozen against the wall, the knife still in his hand but hanging uselessly at his side. From under the bed, Jonathan could see the scene unfold in fragments, the heavy boots pacing, the papers fluttering to the floor, David's trembling legs. Merrick turned back to David. "Where is it? The drive? The files?" His voice was rising, losing its calm veneer. "There's nothing," David insisted, his voice cracking. "I told you." Merrick stepped closer to David, crowding him against the wall. "You're lying." He raised a hand, not to strike, but to grab David by the collar. David flinched backward, away from the reaching hand. It was a small movement, a reflexive act of fear. But in the cramped space, it was enough. His foot caught on the edge of a loose floorboard. He stumbled. He tried to catch himself, but his momentum was wrong. His head swung forward and connected with the sharp corner of the old wooden dresser with a sickening, hollow thud. Time seemed to stop. David crumpled instantly, collapsing to the floor in a heap. Merrick stepped back, his eyes wide with shock. Jonathan, from his hiding place, watched in horror. David lay completely still. A thin trickle of blood began to seep from a wound on his temple, pooling slowly on the worn linoleum. Merrick knelt down, his hand going to David's neck, feeling for a pulse. He stayed there for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he stood up, his expression hardening into something cold and calculating. David was not moving. David was not breathing. The accident had been fatal. Merrick stood over the body, his mind clearly racing. He looked at the door, then back at David. He muttered something under his breath, a curse in a language Jonathan didn't understand. Then, he did something unexpected. He knelt down again and began going through David's pockets, pulling out his wallet, his phone. He was erasing him, removing any trace of the man's identity. He was making it look like a robbery, or like David had simply vanished. He worked quickly, methodically. When he was done, he stood up, took one last look around the room, and walked out. Jonathan lay under the bed, not daring to breathe, for what felt like an eternity. He heard the front door open and close. He heard a car start and drive away. Only then did he allow himself to exhale. He crawled out from under the bed, his body shaking uncontrollably. He looked down at David. The man who had stolen his life was gone. He was a victim of his own fear, killed by a tragic accident. Jonathan was alone in a dead man's house, with a dead man at his feet, and the real killer had just walked away, leaving him to deal with the aftermath. Panic seized him. He had to leave. He had to call the police. But what would he say? That he was hiding under the bed while a man died? That he had witnessed a fatal accident caused by a known criminal? He had no proof. His word against a ghost. And his presence here, in this house, under these circumstances, would be impossible to explain. He was an architect from Port Angeles with a reported identity theft. He would be the prime suspect. The police would not believe his story about a man named Merrick who didn't officially exist. Jonathan's mind, trained to solve structural problems, kicked into a survival mode he didn't know he possessed. He couldn't bring David back. He couldn't catch Merrick. But he could save himself. He looked at David's body, and a terrible, necessary idea formed. He had to make David disappear. He had to make it look like David had run away, just as Merrick had intended. He grabbed a plastic tarp from a closet and, his hands shaking, wrapped the body. He worked in silence, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He dragged the heavy bundle out the back door and into the overgrown yard. Behind the house was a small, neglected shed. Jonathan dragged the body inside and covered it with old boxes and mildewed tarps. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a hiding place. He went back inside and cleaned. He scrubbed the floor where the blood had pooled. He wiped down every surface he might have touched. He worked until his hands were raw, until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the dirty window. When he was done, he stood in the center of the room and took one last look. The house was silent. David was gone. Merrick was gone. Only Jonathan remained. He walked out the front door, closing it quietly behind him. He walked to his motel, packed his bag, and checked out. He caught the first bus back to Port Angeles. He sat by the window, watching the gray landscape blur past, his mind a blank wall of shock. He had gone to confront a thief and had instead witnessed a man die, and had become complicit in hiding the body. The quiet life he had fought to protect was now a lie built on a foundation of sand. Back in Port Angeles, Jonathan tried to resume his routine. He sat by the bay window with his coffee, but the mist no longer looked peaceful. It looked like a shroud. He jumped at every knock on the door, every ring of the phone. He waited for the police. He waited for Merrick. He waited for the world he had tried to escape to come crashing down. Days turned into weeks. Nothing happened. No news from Spokane. No missing person report for David Mercer. No inquiries about a man named Merrick. Life, for everyone else, went on. But for Jonathan, it was a performance. He went through the motions of being the quiet architect, but inside, he was a different man. He had learned that identity was fragile, that a life could be stolen not just by a thief, but by a single, terrible moment. He still looks out the bay window every morning. But now, he isn't watching the mist. He's watching the street, waiting for a car that might never come, haunted by the ghost of a man who died because he was afraid, and by the secret buried in a shed in Spokane. The silence he once loved has become his prison. And he knows, with a certainty that chills him to the bone, that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again.